On a summer day in 1925, 40,000 American Klansmen marched down Pennsylvania Avenue to proclaim their dislike for Catholics, Negroes, and Jews. Though the size of the gathering was unprecedented, the marchers that day were not the first or the last in our nation's history to cast the long shadow of hate. One journey had ended and another had begun. When the first Europeans landed on our shores over 300 years ago. They were refugees from religious persecution, and they were willing to undergo severe hardships to be free of it. But what they saw as their God-given right to be free, they found themselves frequently denying to others. When Africans were brought to the New World in chains, it would be the beginning of over 200 years of American slavery. By 1656, Quakers were persecuted, whipped, imprisoned, banished, and branded. Many were forced from the Massachusetts Bay Colony to survive in the wilderness. The Baptists of Virginia fared no better. Because of their beliefs, some were whipped at the stake, their ears cut off, and their tongues bored with hot irons. It was 200 years later, and intolerance was still with us, when 1.5 million Irish Catholic immigrants filled the slums of Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. Unskilled and illiterate, they were despised and considered violent and animal-like, a threat to the Anglo-Saxon Protestant way of life.
They are filling the prisons, they are filling the juvenile homes, they are filling the welfare rolls.
And they represented another threat. Protestant Americans looked upon the Irish influx not as an accident, but as a conspiracy, engineered by the Vatican and the Pope. The presence of Irish Catholics threw the population into intense alarm and hostility. There were attacks on churches and convents, even anti-Catholic riots. Hate took political form. Prominent Protestants created the American Know-Nothing Party. Their oath, to protect every American by resisting the insidious Church of Rome. To place in all offices, trust or profit, none but Native American Protestant citizens. To vote, nor give influence for any man, for any office, unless he be an American-born citizen, in favor of Americans ruling America. The only real Americans by this time were a defeated people. Forced from their land, hundreds of tribes had seen their life destroyed by the white man. One band outside the reservation was the Lakota Sioux, but their time was running out. With their women and children dying of disease and hunger, they moved toward the Pine Ridge Reservation.
They were just going somewhere to be able to get food for their people and to be able to make peace.
Army had a cavalry posted all around them.
But they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know if they were going to make it back.
Under a white flag of truce, the Army ordered the Indians to move to a camp on Wounded Knee Creek. The soldiers were ordered to take all weapons out of Indian hands. A gun discharge.
It sounded like thunder to a band of people that were totally disarmed.
Women, old ladies, kids, just wiped them out.
They died slow and terrible deaths.
They dug a big trench, just tossed them in there.
They killed them all.
$400 and some men, women, and children.
Bigotry, prejudice made his dent into the New World.
Chinese laborers brought to the New World also faced a suspicious and harsh America. It was back-breaking work laying tracks over the California mountains and across the deserts of Nevada and Utah.
Work for slightly below $1 a day.
They had to do all of the work that no one else would do.
The chief obstacle was the Sierra Nevada. These are granite mountains. The problem was, well, how to, penetrate these mountains.
Under intense heat and then intense cold,
The Central Pacific Railroad decided then to work the Chinese crews in the dead of winter. Had to work in tunnels under the snowdrifts. Sometimes these snowdrifts would collapse and their bodies were not found until the following spring.
They lost between 15 to 18% of their labor through accidents and deaths.
—
They could not have built it without the Chinese.
When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, thousands of Chinese were forced into slums and isolated towns throughout the West.
Chinese got pushed out of one town after another. They were confined to ghettos. We heard a lot about lynching of blacks in the South, also lynching of the Chinese.
In 1885, a band of whites murdered Chinese in Seattle. In Tacoma, a white mob drove 700 Chinese men, women, and children from their homes.
They actually were massacred in Rock Spring, Wyoming.
In 1882, Congress passed an Immigration Act.
It simply says that Chinese cannot become citizens of the United States. You had the prostitutes, the lepers, and the morons were excluded from immigration. The Congress added the Chinese to that list.
None were more proud of being American than Japanese immigrants who began arriving in this country in 1900. Within a generation, they had transformed American agriculture in the West. They were successful in establishing their own businesses and farms. But they were denied rights as Americans.
Our parents couldn't buy homes because they couldn't become naturalized citizens by law.
When the war broke out between the United States and Japan, Japanese Americans were eager to volunteer for the war effort. But the government ordered over 100,000 persons of Japanese descent, citizens and non-citizens alike, into custody. They were given 1 week to sell what they owned, including their homes and businesses, and prepare for evacuation.
A lot of people lost everything.
I wasn't even classified as an American citizen anymore. I didn't have a country.
We were singled out as disloyal.
Being an American citizen don't mean a thing. The Constitution is just a piece of paper.
None of my non-Japanese friends ever came to say goodbye to me.
They let us off the train in the middle of the desert. There were something like 9,000 people within less than a mile.
We kept saying, Mama, this is America. She was so afraid that we were going to be killed.
The camps were overcrowded. 100,000 shared community toilets, mess halls, and washrooms.
We were all in one room.
Three years and 4 months.
Life in camp was most difficult for the elderly. They had left the old country for the new. Now that was taken from them, like everything else they owned. For the young, beyond the barbed wire, there was always tomorrow. But for others, time had run out. As months passed, young men were eventually allowed to volunteer for the U.S. Armed Forces. Their regiment, the 442nd Infantry, became the most decorated unit in United States military history. Felix Longoria joined the U.S. Army from Three Rivers, Texas. He was one of over 150,000 Mexican Americans who saw combat in World War II.
Three Rivers, Texas, that's where we lived. All of us, all of the Hispanic people were discriminated against. The sad part about it is that we thought that that was the way of life.
After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the young men of Three Rivers left to go to war. Felix Longoria was one of them. Married with a 2-year-old daughter, he was sent to the Pacific where his division went into combat in the Philippines.
They only had one child, little girl. He went overseas. My sister received the terrible notice that he had died. She went to Three Rivers to make arrangements for his body to be brought home.
But his widow was told that they would not conduct a funeral for a Mexican American.
The funeral director, he said, we cannot do that because the whites will not like that. This is not right. He is being refused a place to lay his body. For someone to deny services to someone that had given his life in a strange land.
The news about Felix Longoria reached beyond Texas, and it was arranged for his body to be shipped 1,500 miles to Washington and Arlington Cemetery.
Why should I have come so many miles away to this cemetery? How many Felix Longoria cases must have gone unheard of?
For almost 100 years after the Civil War, a black man's life depended as much on the whim of a white man as on the courts of justice. By 1950, over 3,000 African Americans had been lynched. James Cameron was one of the few who lived to tell the story. Following older boys bent on robbery, Cameron became scared and ran home to his mother's house.
I can see her standing there at the door, wringing her hands and asking the police to take her instead of me. I can never forget that. Then they came back and got me. When the mob came up, they said, "James Cameron, come out here, we want you." The mob began to chant for me like a football player. They said, "We want Cameron, we want Cameron, we want Cameron." And I thought my blood would freeze in my body. The mob said, "If you don't tell us where he is, we're going to lynch every damn one of you. All you niggas get over on this side of the cell block." And then the beating started. Put the rope around my neck. Then they began shoving me under the tree where Tom and Abe were hanging. And then it happened. All at once a voice came out, a loud, echoing voice. To take this boy back, he had nothing to do with any raping or killing. They were having their fun. They were lynching black people. Everybody was in a gay mood. It was a real Americana.
The indiscriminate killing of blacks by whites in the name of justice reached its peak in the South during the 1920s and 30s. Sometimes over 100 hangings and burnings a year took place. Atlanta, Georgia, in the early part of the century, was the fastest growing city in the South. Young people were leaving small towns and farms for factory wages.
Children worked in those sweatshops. I think it was $1.10 for a week's worth of work.
One company that was doing well was National Pencil, owned by a respected Jewish family that had lived in Atlanta since before the Civil War. Most jobs were performed by young girls. One of them, Mary Fagan, was from Marietta, Georgia. On a Saturday afternoon, she came to an empty factory to pick up a week's wages. She never left the building alive. Her mutilated body was found in the basement.
This was a major murder. And the murder was a brutal murder. Her dress had been torn. Her face was blackened. And there was demands to find the killer.
One of only 2 men in the building that day was Leo Frank, nephew of the owner, who had come from New York to run the factory.
He didn't look like one of us.
The city of Atlanta spoke of nothing else and called for vengeance.
The minister who had officiated at Mary Fagan's funeral, thank God we finally have a defendant worthy to pay for this horrendous crime. Not just some black factory sweeper, but a rich Jew from Brooklyn.
Men like Tom Watson were more than spectators. In the Frank case, Watson saw an opportunity to bolster his magazine's flagging circulation and a failing political career.
He wrote stories that said, if a black man had raped a white girl, we'd know what to do with him. Why should a Jew get any different justice or treatment?
The trial began on a sweltering day in July.
The windows were open. And the mobs outside were yelling in, "Get the Jew, kill the Jew."
If things were said that were favorable to Leo Frank, the crowd outside would boo. If things were said that were unfavorable to Frank, crowds would cheer. The jury was paraded from a hotel to the courthouse each day. They were afraid they would be lynched if they didn't convict Leo Frank.
On August 25th, after just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Frank was sentenced to die by hanging. Governor John Slayton was convinced the trial was a sham and that the evidence pointed to the other man in the factory that day. He commuted Frank's sentence to life imprisonment.
Governor Slayton was finished.
Mobs moved on the executive mansion, urged on by Tom Watson to lynch the governor. Only the presence of the National Guard kept Slayton and his wife from injury and death. "100 miles southeast of Atlanta, Leo Frank was being held at the Milledgeville prison. One night, 25 men wearing masks entered the prison and pulled Frank from his bed.
They cut the phone lines and walked in. Never fired a shot.
The next morning in Marietta, Georgia, a large crowd gathered under an oak tree. Leo Frank had been lynched.
Nobody would cut it down. People walked up to the body and tore off pieces of Frank's clothes as souvenirs.
And I remember they used to say, "Little Mary Fagan went to work one day. Little did she know the Jew would take a life away.
Tom Watson's success in the Frank case vaulted him into the U.S. Senate. He would not be the first or the last to use race and religion for political gain. Theodore Gilmore Bilbo became master of the technique.
Very intelligent, and he had a sense of exactly what the people of Mississippi would buy, would accept.
But it's absolutely
He spoke their language,
This did happen.
and he would urge all the blacks to return to their native land.
Caucus has lasted 57 days and nights.
And that had great enthusiastic support here among the whites in Mississippi.
I said further that it was the duty of every white Democrat in Mississippi to resort to every means within the law to keep the niggers from voting in our primary because they were not qualified to vote. The best time to keep a nigger away from a white Democratic primary in Mississippi was to see him the night before and tell him that he had no right. Well, you can call it what you may. It's good diplomacy and good strategy to keep him from voting if we propose to hold and retain white control within our state, which we propose to do.
I never knew him to be wrong.
Hate and suspicion of others was not confined to the middle class, to the poor, or politicians. Henry Ford was none of these.
He's the only extremely wealthy industrialist who was ever a folk hero.
The size and breadth of Henry Ford's industrial empire was staggering. Worldwide, he employed 500,000 people. He was admired by and shared ideas with the famous. But his views ranged far beyond business.
Henry Ford was a committed and radical pacifist. So he bought his own newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. He decided that he was going to expose Jews. He believed Jews were the cause of wars. He believed that the international Jewish financiers were supplying the money for weapons, and they didn't care who lost. In one of the articles, they even claimed the Catholic Queen Isabella, who financed Columbus, was really a front for 3 secret Jews, and blamed the Jews for everything: jazz, liquor, everything that bothered Henry Ford. He made the Ford dealers sell the Dearborn Independent. It had a circulation of 700,000. How do you actually ever know the damage? And then you can never undo it.
Today, America still struggles with intolerance. Today, America still struggles with those who hate. Some still prefer to use the familiar message and retain the old symbols. Others have chosen to use the respectability of public office. Others, the popular pulpit of religion.
Minister Farrakhan!
It is time to require the able-bodied welfare recipient to do work for the welfare.
David Duke was Imperial Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, celebrated Hitler's birthday, sold Nazi literature from his legislative office, and received 60% of the white vote in his home state.
I never called Judaism a gutter religion. I said the practice of lying, stealing.
The Reverend Louis Farrakhan has preached racial separatism
Using God's holy name to shield your dirty religion, not the
and blamed Jews for black problems.
your dirty practices using God's holy name. Do you hear what I'm saying?
You could just feel the hate.
If you're going to be tolerant of people, you got to understand them. You got to find out the truth.
You know, it was Lincoln who talked about, well, what is it that binds us together? And Lincoln said, this nation was founded, dedicated to the proposition of equality.